listeners, and welcome to the fourth lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. As promised in the previous lecture, I will discuss William Butler Yeats's iconic and very influential poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. This will make this video the first in-depth analysis and focus on an individual poet. In a way, this marks the beginning of the discussion of poets and poetry proper in this course. As you will recall, in the previous lectures, I have spent a lot of time describing the geographical, political, nationalistic, as well as cultural contexts in which poetry that is called modernism today and poetry which was historically produced in the early 20th century came to be. From a discussion of the context, the general forces, the movement of people and commodities, which we have discussed in the previous lectures, in this lecture, the course moves towards the discussion of individuals, human beings, who produced some of the most powerful and influential words, poems, extremely moving documents of human consciousness, of human experiences. That is ultimately what continues to memorialize times for us, the way the times are remembered and described and filtered through the consciousness of especially sensitive and astute human beings. The first such astute, sensitive, skilled human being poet that we will discuss is William Butler Yeats. Now, the name of Yeats is very famous. Yeats is among the many poets we will discuss, perhaps the most famous and is a household name. Yeats's poetry is considered among the best and the most powerful in all the poetry that was written in the entire 20th century. So it will be useful to understand where and how these powerful words came to be written. Who was this person? How did he come to write some of these words that he did? The poem that we will discuss is The Lake Isle of Innisfree, a poem that was published in Yeats's very first collection of poetry titled The Wanderings of Oisin. The Lake Isle of Innisfree is a very famous poem. In fact, there are hardly any poems by Yeats which are not famous. And yet it can be said that the Lake Isle of Innisfree is less famous than some of the other more famous Yeats poems like No Second Troy, The Second Coming, Sailing to Byzantium, Among School Children, and some of the others. These, the poems that I just named, are from Yeats's later collections, from collections that Yeats wrote when he was already very firmly established as a great, respected, revered poet, public figure, almost a sage. As opposed to those poems, The Lake Isle of Innisfree is a poem that Yeats wrote when he was barely known writer. In fact, he was no one in the who's who in the world of poetry. He was a young man beginning his career as a poet. And so it has a very special value because it helps us understand how the experiences and the context that this young man had gone through filtered through and became a part of his writing. So that's what we will do first. We will try and establish the context, the experiences, the social world from which William Butler Yeats emerged, and then jump right into the words of this poem to try and understand how 20th century poetry began. William Butler Yeats was born in the year 1865 and passed away in the year 1939. That is a long time. It's almost a century, half of the 19th century and almost half of the 20th. So in this long period, Yeats witnessed a lot of different things. And so Yeats's place is both as a Victorian as well as a modern poet. Now, it has to be said that in most scholarly discussions of modernism, Yeats does not feature as a typical modernist poet. That is to say, Yeats is not discussed in the same breath as, say, T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound. That is changing as more and more scholars are beginning to notice that even though Yeats's iconic work was published at a slightly different time, and he also held views that were views about poetry and views about form and aesthetics that were a little bit more old fashioned than, say, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. Yeats was very much a modernist poet. How so? On one hand, Yeats's views about poetry were very old fashioned. That is to say, Yeats referred to Mr. T.S. Eliot as a revolutionist. What does that mean? It means that Yeats's views of how poetry works, how poetry relates to society, how poetry produces the consciousness that poets strive to produce, how poetry provides the joy and the understanding to its readers. In all of these respects, Yeats's views were less modern than that of T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound. I have spent the previous lectures explaining how T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound defined and argued for newness in poetry. Yeats was not such a poet. Yeats did not stake his claim on the newness of the theory of his poetry. So in that sense, Yeats is different. However, in many other senses, Yeats was very similar to T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. That is to say, all of these poets were unconvinced or unpersuaded that the times in which they lived really fulfilled the promise of being modern times. That is to say, these three poets were frustrated with the changes they saw around them. They were not convinced that modern times were truly good times. There was a contradiction, therefore, in the way these poets aligned social modernity with aesthetic modernism. The poetry that these writers produced was new and powerful and moving, but it was in contradiction to the newness and the power of the times in which they lived. All three poets were dissatisfied with the times in which they lived, and it is this dissatisfaction which makes the case that despite Yeats's somewhat old-fashioned views on the aesthetic theory of poetry, he deserves to be considered as a powerful and influential modernist poet. In the case of Yeats, the contradiction between social modernity and aesthetic modernism took the form of a tension between Ireland and England. In order to understand this, we have to understand the deeper and older historical context of Ireland. Ireland was made up of two kinds of communities. One was the Catholic Irish community, and the other was the Protestant Irish community. There are many ways of describing these differences, but I will choose one. It will be a somewhat simplistic and somewhat summarized view of a rich and complex history, but it will serve to illustrate who Yeats was and where he came from and why he wrote the way he did. The Catholic Irish community was an older community, whereas the Protestant Irish community was a somewhat newer community. The Protestant Irish community was made up of people who had migrated from London, England, fleeing Catholic persecution. The Catholic Irish community traced back their lineage in centuries. They were also poorer, they did not own much property, and they also did not command many high positions in government or business. Culturally, however, staying for the moment with the Catholic Irish community, this was a richer community. It was very much in touch with their native language, religion, and traditions. More individuals in this community spoke Irish. They were very proudly native Irish. They were connected to Celtic myths and traditions. Now, moving to the other community, which is the Protestant Irish community, I mentioned that this was a younger community, a newer community. That is to say, they could trace back their lineage to maybe one or two generations. They owned a lot of business, they owned a lot of land, They also owned property and commanded high positions in the government and business. Now, William Butler Yeats was born to a traditionally wealthy Protestant Irish family. That said, the privileges that this family was born to, especially Yeats's father, John Butler Yeats, these privileges of money, culture, etc., began to dry up almost as soon as the eldest son, William, was born. Uh, his father, John Butler Yeats, came from a landowning, rent supported Protestant family. A lot of this family was comfortably placed. Uh, a lot of these men were clergymen in the Church of England. A lot of them were lawyers, merchants, and landowners. Yeats Sr., that is John Butler Yeats, was expected to follow in this line. He had just finished college and was expected to study law and therefore enter the government, or to study religion and become a clergyman with a comfortable financial and land-owning arrangement. At this time, he married, and his wife, Susan Mary Yeats, who was earlier Susan Mary Pollexfen, expected a comfortable life of bourgeois Irish material stability. This did not happen, however, because of a sudden change in the course of education that John was undertaking. John decided to give up on his studies of the law and to switch course and to study art and become a painter. This decision produced considerable financial and material hardship for the family, and especially for the young wife, that is Susan Mary Pollexfen Yeats. The decision to study art in London meant that the Yeatses were plunged somewhat suddenly and without warning into a life of poverty and relative squalor. Squalor, not absolute but relative, because it was a life of more hardship than the typical Irish gentry was used to. Instead, the Yeatses found themselves in European and English Bohemia. They dealt with a lot of financial instability, and this meant that the early years of the marriage and the early years of Yeats's childhood were passed in somewhat of a gloomy state. One reason for the lack of financial stability, and one reason why the decision to study art, John's decision to study art, produced financial stability was not simply that art was not recognized. It has to do with the way land ownership and tenancy was changing in the time that they were in. This was a time of the Land League and the Land War in 19th century Ireland. A lot of poor Catholic tenants were encouraged by nationalist leaders to delay or refuse rent to their Protestant landlords. And John's family was a direct victim of these tendencies. Yeats Sr. Had planned to study art because he thought he could depend on the rent which was coming in from the many tracts of land and property that the family had owned and had owned for a long time. Due to these land wars, due to depleting rent, due to the difficulties of owning land as a Protestant landlord, they were forced to sell off a lot of land. And by 1880, John Yeats, Yeats Sr., had lost all of his inherited property and inherited land and could not depend on any income coming in from rent. As a result, two things happened. The Yeats family moved from London to Ireland, and even before they did that, the increasing financial uncertainty meant that the family spent a lot of time in the children's maternal home. This was in the county of Sligo, a Western Irish seaport. This was the home of the Pollexfens, and this was a massive house called Merville, a mansion built on 60 acres of land very close to the Irish Sea. As this description makes clear, it was a phenomenal, breathtaking, and really comfortable estate. The source of this comfort was also class and business. The Pollocksvins were wealthy, independent businessmen. They owned land, but they were not dependent on land. They also owned manufacturing and shipping businesses. Uh, the consequence of spending a lot of time, that is entire summers and many years in Yeats's, that is William Yeats's early childhood in Morville, left a lasting impression on the poet. These years and these summers defined for the poet material comfort, but also the value of being connected to large families, surrounded by uncles, aunts, relatives, all of whom were Irish, and also being surrounded in these small communities by diverse professional and economic classes of people, again Irish. So both family and in terms of society, the lasting impression of Morville was the value of being connected to people like one's own. This became a very painful memory for the young poet as he was going to school and college in London. Another lasting impression of these summers and these early years in their maternal grandparents' home was some of the most breathtaking scenery in Ireland. East of Sligo, where this house was, borders both islands and water bodies. The water body most prominent there is Lough Gill, and it lapped many small islands. One such island in this water body across the coast of Sligo was Innisfree, which Yeats immortalized in his poem The Lake Isle of Innisfree, which we will discuss a little bit later. Now, Yeats's childhood, early years were marked by frequent shuttling between London and Ireland. Both of these moves were motivated by John's quest, that is Yeats Sr., William Yeats's father John, his quest for a successful and sustainable career as a painter. In the year 1881, when all rent dried up and financial hardships reached a peak, the family moved back to Ireland to a fishing village named Howth. During this time, the father John and the eldest son William shuttled between Howth and Dublin by train every day, where John worked at a studio in Dublin and William went to school. The two schools that William went to during his early childhood in Ireland were the Erasmus Smith High School and from 1884 onwards, the Metropolitan School of Art. Inspired by his father, William initially wanted to become an artist. By 1886, however, the poet had begun to become very clear about his vocation and his goal and abandoned painting for writing. He decided to make sense of his world through his words. Now, religion and politics were also very important for the budding poet. I mentioned earlier that Yeats Sr., John, was a skeptic and was influenced by Victorian science, which inspired his decision to give up the study of law or religion and instead to study art. Influenced by his father, William also moved away from institutional Christianity, but did not give up his quest for spirituality. Indeed, the young poet's quest for spirituality deepened, and in the words of the scholar David Haldeman, the young Yeats had developed an unquenchable desire for some form of spiritual wholeness, which is capable of easing the world and self-splintering tensions he felt so keenly. So what did this quest for spirituality lead to? In the first instance, it led to a strong interest in and influence of the intellectual movement named Theosophy. The advocate and the leader of this movement was Madame Blavatsky, and inspired by this group, William Butler Yeats took part in a lot of seances, called up spirits, began to believe in a lot of the orthodox aspects of religions, began to read about Hinduism and Buddhism, and also began to develop a belief in magic. And inspired by all of these thoughts, began to define the power of poetry in the language of magic. For Yeats, again quoting Haldeman, there was a tantalizing similarity between the aesthetic wholeness created by a poem and the harmonizing supernatural powers of a magical spell. Poems used symbols to evoke mysterious forces that promised to fit life's broken fragments into a deeper hidden unity. The word fragment is very telling here because it connects to some of the theories of aesthetics as well as the actual poems written by the more avowedly self fashioned modernists, that is, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. The word fragments features very prominently in T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, which ends with the words, "These fragments I have shored against my ruin." Yeats also was very much aware that modern life was fragmented, but the way to deal with such fragmentation took very different forms in the work of William Butler Yeats. Now, we've talked about religion. It's important to talk a little bit about politics as well. As I mentioned earlier, the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Ireland were a time of great cultural nationalism. There was a movement among a lot of the Irish Catholics to challenge the influence of Britain through a challenge against the Protestant Irish community. Now, this movement grew in strength and intensity as Yeats grew older and began to influence his writing as well. John O'Leary was a nationalist who encouraged the young poet to write patriotic poetry in favor of Irish Home Rule. Despite a lot of encouragements, William Butler Yeats remained somewhat indifferent to these political causes. While personally he felt very strongly about individuals and about the suffering of individuals, in his public positions, he remained hesitant to join or to put his name in support of any particular political movement. This remained something that caused a lot of problem for the poet in his career and has remained something that a lot of scholars, even today, find it very difficult to accept or appreciate in the work of Yeats. His political indifference, which in the face of inequality, violence, and suffering, such neutrality began to take shape of a conservatism which today has been called fascism. There's a great deal of modernist scholarship engaging with the fascism of the great modernist poets. Now, in the work of Ezra Pound, the fascism is somewhat easy to accept, and there is less of a debate about whether this great poet was in fact a fascist. That's because Ezra Pound left no ambiguity and put pen to paper, that is to say, joined the fascist causes of many governments in the 20th century. Same with T.S. Eliot, who, if not politically, in terms of religion and in terms of his intellectual work, took on a very avowedly conservative role. In the work of Yeats, however, the relationship between conservative politics or fascism and his writing as a poet is less clear, somewhat more ambiguous. Therefore, scholars have been able to still redeem some of Yeats's writing. Nonetheless, we can still see the beginnings of this conservatism in Yeats's refusal to speak very strongly or to write poetry that was unabashedly patriotic. This indifference to politics might be traced to the attitude that Yeats's father, that is Yeats Sr., John, took towards these questions of Irish nationalism. Yeats Sr.'s position reflected an unresolved contradiction between two attitudes, both equally strong and neither able to override the other. The first was a pride in Irish identity, and the second was an equal and strong pride in the codes of Irish gentlemanly behavior. While the first can be traced to a Catholic side, that is to say, pride and Irish identity. The second, that is, codes of Irish gentlemanly behavior, can be said to be a somewhat Protestant attitude. Now, we can understand this in two decisions that John took. On one hand, John did not support unionism. Unionism was a set of political and social convictions which centered on the preservation of Ireland's political union with Great Britain. If Ireland became a part of Great Britain, it would have implications for certain communities. That is to say, it would benefit the Protestant Irish community. These were the descendants of the colonists who had crossed the Irish Sea during the centuries-long effort to merge Catholic Ireland with Protestant Britain's empire. Despite unionism having clear implications for the benefit and uplift of the Protestant Irish community, Yeats Sr., that is John Butler Yeats, did not support this movement. What might have been the reason for this? Another decision that John took was that he also did not embrace the alternative to unionism, which was Home Rule. Home Rule would have given Ireland its own autonomous legislature. Now, while Home Rule might have appeared to be a more attractive, more democratic, more egalitarian alternative to unionism, because it did not seem to benefit either side unfairly. That is, if Home Rule was established, neither the Protestant Irish nor the Catholic Irish community would be unfairly advantaged, and Ireland as a region would have its own legislature, and it would give equality to people irrespective of whether they were Catholic or Protestant. However, Yeats Sr. did not support Home Rule either, and the reason was that he did not approve of the political tactics used by a very influential public leader, Charles Stewart Parnell, the leader of the Irish Party in the British Parliament. Before being driven from power by a scandal in the year 1890, Parnell used his control over both the Land League and the Irish Party to maneuver the British Parliament to the verge of granting Home Rule. So these were some of the political and religious movements and contexts which shaped the growth of this young poet. In the year 1889, when Yeats published his first volume of poetry, The Wanderings of Oisin, Yeats was being pulled culturally and spiritually in two directions. Spatially as well, Yeats was separated and pulled between London and Ireland. London was the place of education, the place where the family had gone to for personal development, but also a place of great hardship and deprivation. Both material deprivation, because the family was not very wealthy, but also cultural deprivation, because Yeats did not feel that he belonged there. Alternatively, the opposite extreme of London was Sligo. Sligo was a place, although it existed more in memory than in reality, it was a very fresh memory. It was a memory of material comfort, maternal comfort, a great deal of cultural belonging, breathtaking scenery, idyllic nature, even though it was only available to rich landowners. And the maternal side of Yeats' family, thankfully, were rich landowners. Also, culturally, Yeats in the year 1889 was influenced by a whole host of Victorian literary and cultural voices. These were voices like those of William Blake, Percy Shelley, but also writers like William Morris and the pre-Raphaelite poets, who were very critical of industrialization in Victorian London. So in the writings of these voices, whom Yeats had read as a young poet, criticized the factories, the slums, the smoke, the disease, and all other ills that capitalism had unleashed in London, which was the great financial and manufacturing capital of the world. As a counter to these ills and vices, Yeats thought of pre-industrial values. These were values that came from his memories of Sligo, but also from the literature and culture that he had been reading. And he remembered Sligo more particularly because Western Ireland was relatively freer, less corrupted by the influence, cultural as well as economic influence of England. The eastern part of Ireland was more accessible to migration from England, and therefore this western part, which was both faced by sea, surrounded by beautiful islands, but also was free of the cultural influence of the English language as well as English culture. Now, the people and the place that Yeats remembered from Sligo was valuable to Yeats at this time because these were people who still spoke Irish, and many more preserved distinctively Irish stories and values. In his early 20s, that is, when Yeats wrote his first volume of poetry, Yeats was searching for the answers to his spiritual and political questions in the folk beliefs of Ireland's Western country people and the heroic myths of the whole island's ancient Gaelic culture. These traditions, he felt, preserved satisfying ways of life and eternal spiritual truths that had been forgotten in modernized places like England, and that were threatened even in Ireland by the encroachment of British culture. This is the position, intellectually, culturally, spiritually, that Yeats was in. This was the position Yeats was in when he wrote The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will briefly read the poem and then give a hint as to the tone and the contours that our analysis will take. This is how the poem reads. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings, there midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core. Very briefly, the key to interpreting the poem, or several clues to how we can begin interpreting the poem, can be found in the third stanza, chiefly the words roadway and pavement's grey. Yeats wrote this poem, or got the idea for this poem, when he was walking down a street in London, Fleet Street to be accurate. This is what Yeats writes and remembers in his autobiography. The street of London, the heart of urbanity, forces the poet to remember. If not force, it is a very unconscious, impulsive act of reconnecting with his past. The urban London, the city of London, reminds the poet of an island off the coast of Ireland. This is the Lake Isle of Innisfree. But it is not a simple act of transporting himself through his memory from an urbanized city to this very idyllic natural landscape. The very act of remembering this past becomes a politically, culturally, and intellectually challenging activity. A lot of contradictions are revealed. Yeats discovers in the act of writing about this memory that it is not easy for him to simply remember and transform his life. In fact, it is the act of remembering which begins a very complex process of negotiation. Yeats has to negotiate his cultural upbringing, the economic class in which he finds himself, the career that he has chosen to make, and the political as well as the spiritual changes that are taking place around him. How all of these challenges are unleashed by the simple act of walking down Fleet Street in London and remembering a very peaceful and imagining a very idyllic and peaceful cottage in this Lake Isle of Innisfree. We will understand all of this in the next lecture. Thank you.